We're talking about the world of the New Testament. One of the key features that we want to keep on our radar as we're thinking about the New Testament is the impact of the exile. All right. Exile is movement out of the land of Israel. And this happens in two moves in Israel's story. So I wanted to begin by showing us just a map so we can see this first piece. When we think about the Old Testament and Israel's story, we often think of Israel as being this kind of collective whole. But in fact, that's really only a blip on the radar in terms of the story that the Old Testament tells, right? You have more or less a confederation of these tribes that come out of Egypt, a mixed rabble, as Moses tells us, and they come into the land, and it's a kind of a very mixed deal for a while. Eventually, there is a monarchy that's formed. The height of it would be David, King David, whom we all know from the Old Testament, and his son Solomon. Following Solomon, there is a division within the people, and this becomes the reality that we see in much of the historical books and in the prophetic literature, is a division within Israel where the north is established as Israel or sometimes Ephraim, the 10 tribes, and Judah in the south. Okay. It's important to keep in mind that within Judah is the city Jerusalem, where the temple of God is built. David wants to build God's house, and God says, no, but someone from your line will build my house. His successor is Solomon, and Solomon builds the house of God, the first temple in Jerusalem, in Judah. Okay. So what happens, right? You've got this established kingdom. You've got a temple where Yahweh, the God of Israel, dwells, where people can access his presence. Well, due to the people's disobedience, you have several moves of exile or deportation from the land. There's several deportations, but officially in 722, Assyria takes Israel. Assyria was the big superpower in the region at this time. You can see them mentioned in a number of the prophets, Assyrian kings. There's the threat. They came all the way down to Judah. There was a threat that's mentioned in the book of Isaiah, for example. And you can see there's a lot of disdain for Assyrians within the prophetic literature. They're basically like, imagine the worst type of folk, right, that you can possibly imagine. It's the Assyrians, right? Not even Babylon's really bad, but Babylon even destroyed the temple. But like the worst of the worst, Assyrians, right? I mean, that's kind of the idea, right? So they're all over the prophetic literature. They wipe out the 10 tribes here. And what remains then is Judah, this part in the south here. The next major superpower that comes in is Babylon, right, to the east. And the Babylonians come in and they also deport groups from Judah. And then something which was prophesied about, for example, in Jeremiah, something devastating happens in 586. The Babylonians actually lay waste to the temple. All right. So this is like the most devastating event in the Hebrew Bible, the destruction of the temple. Okay. That's the center. That's where God dwells with his people. And that is laid to waste. And they're brought off to Babylon. We get in some prophetic literature, like Daniel, stories of God's people in exile in Babylon. And then we get stories of return. All right. So we'll talk about the Cyrus and the Persians here in a moment. But these two moves of the Assyrians and the Babylonians are critical because even after the people will come back into the land, the story of exile thoroughly shapes how the Old Testament is put together and read, right? So the Old Testament, especially kind of in its final form, because we think about God's people were together for quite a long time. Some of these books are written over a long period of time, right? Maybe 1,000-year period or something less. But in its kind of final constellation, the Old Testament is put together by groups from Judah, right? People that come back to the land after exile. And the exile being ripped away and learning how to kind of survive and think about being God's people in that state, awaiting God's full promises, that has a big shaping impact on the way the Old Testament is put together and understood. And why that's so important for the New Testament is when you open up to the New Testament, the first gospel you'll read is the Gospel of Matthew, okay? And Matthew opens with a genealogy of 3 sets of 14 generations from Abraham to David, 14 generations from David to the Babylonian exile, 14 generations from the exile to the Messiah. So that is to say, there's a way of telling the story of Israel as a people waiting for God's definitive move to put things right as a result of exile, right? So even as we have them being moved out of the land, we're going to talk about them coming back into the land. This narrative of exile deeply shapes the faith of the Jewish people of this period, okay? Doesn't mean everybody thought one way about it, but when many tell the theology of what's currently going wrong in the land when they come back, they continuously draw on this idea of exile. So I just want to highlight that as something that's very, very important for Israel's story. It was important for the people that put our Old Testament together, people who are Judeans, because, I mean, get this too, okay? So you have people coming back to the land after Babylon to this area, and yet in all of their hopes, their prophetic hopes, they're constantly looking forward to the reunification of Israel as a whole. That is to say, all 12 tribes, the tribes that have been scattered. The term that's used is diaspora, means kind of like a scattering throughout, right? They're looking forward to a time where God is going to put it all back together, okay? So keep in mind for our time in next week why you think Jesus might have chosen 12 to call apostles, right? They're looking forward to the putting together of all 12 tribes, okay? So that's another piece we'll get into. Okay, so exile is really, really important. First, the Assyrian deportations, and then the Babylonian exile. So what ends the Babylonian exile is a new empire comes on the scene. After Babylon, we hear about this in the book of Daniel, prophesying about the coming of a new empire, and we hear the mention of some of these Persians, right? And the main Persian ruler was a guy named Cyrus. Cyrus's deal was a bit different. He imagined his empire as being one in which people were allowed to live in their native spaces under the auspices of his empire. So he sees himself as kind of a liberator figure. And you find these sort of folk in the ancient world and even today. They cast themselves as kind of the Messiah or the savior of people of the world. And Cyrus comes along and casts himself as the liberator of different groups of people, including the Jews, sends them back to their native land and allows them to worship there. So that's why the exiles in Babylon return, because of the Edict of Cyrus. We have this archaeological piece of evidence here called the Cyrus cylinder. And this is nice because it's written in a script called cuneiform. It's a very, you can see complex kind of script to read. I can't read it. I don't know. Can you read it? No. Okay. So our knowledge stops somewhere, right? We can't. But the idea is that with the cylinder, you would kind of turn it and read it. And this is helpful for us because we can see how Cyrus presented himself to the rest of the world. So this is like firsthand account of Cyrus's propaganda of how he presents himself to the world as this liberator figure. And among the many groups he mentions, the Jews or Judeans. We also have in the Old Testament the mention of of what Cyrus had done here. I didn't anticipate this little bar here. Maybe I can move it just for this.
You can minimize it.
Okay, I'll minimize it. And then if you have a question online, don't hesitate to...
I think it's that top one.
Yeah, to just unmute yourself. You can, So this just gives you an example of, right, Cyrus presents himself as the one who's ultimately in control, right, the Lord of Lords. But from the Jewish perspective, Jewish theology, this is how the book of Ezra opens up. You can see Cyrus the Persian here, but when Cyrus issues his decree, he sees himself here in Ezra as the servant of the Lord. I'll just read the highlighted part. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. He has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem in Judah. So the second temple is going to be built with the help of Cyrus, right? Cyrus, again, seeing himself as kind of this liberator figure, it adds to his prestige if he contributes to this temple.
When he says the Lord, does he mean Yahweh?
Yeah, that's how it's being presented here, right?
Yeah.
So when you compare what we have in the Old Testament to what he says, right? I think we have to keep in mind that this is a little bit of Jewish theology, right? Kind of presenting the ultimate view of what's really motivating Cyrus.
Yeah, I would think he would have his own God or something.
Totally. But you see this happen here in Daniel, for example, right? The Babylonian kings recognize the Lord God. So you have these moments where these foreign rulers recognize the one true God, right? And this is, of course, being articulated from their perspective, right? So it's kind of almost like if you pull back the curtain and see like what's really going on.
Yeah.
It's Yahweh that's operating, right? That's working sovereignly, whether or not the ruler knows it.
True.
Right.
Yeah.
And we see this we have this example. This is even more radical. This is from Isaiah. All right. Look at what this is the Lord. This is the oracle. Thus says Yahweh, the Lord, to his Messiah, Cyrus. This is the only time in the Old Testament where a pagan is called Messiah. It's pretty astonishing, right? Whose right hand I have grasped. So you could plug in Jesus Christ here and it would work really well. Just as an example, right? But the point is here, Yahweh is working through Cyrus. There is no king. There is no Davidic king in Israel's history at this point. And so God, Yahweh, who's sovereign over all the nations, he's not just the God of Israel, he's the God of all nations. He here is working through Cyrus to liberate the people of Israel. So you can see here he addresses Cyrus directly, even though you don't know me, I've called you by name, right? Mm-hmm. So you get that kind of dynamic here. Yeah.
So why is both Christian and Jewish theology not give credit enough that he is the only person ever to be called the Lord's Messiah?
Cyrus?
Yeah.
Well, he's not the only person.
Who else?
Other kings, other kings of Israel.
Messiah?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So the term Messiah, thanks for asking the question. The term Messiah or Mashiach is used throughout the Hebrew Bible to refer to kings of Israel, as well as you have the term applied to anointed priests, right? Because the term has it in its root, ritual anointing. The anointing of the person, as we sometimes still use oil today in the church for purposes of consecration, the oil consecrates the person for office, whether priest or king. There are a couple instances where prophets are also labeled Messiah, perhaps, but it's primarily for priests and kings. And what's interesting about that is even after the ritual stopped, right? So around the time of Jesus, let's say, they weren't really, well, there weren't kings there, but they probably weren't anointing people in the same way. The term is still understood to mean anointed, and you still find it everywhere. So it still bears meaning, even after the original rituals maybe aren't as established as they were at the other parts in the Bible. So its function is to designate the ruler, whether it's a priest or a king, whom God has chosen to lead, right? This instance it's kind of a unique instance because it's the only place where you'll find a non-Israelite, non-Jew called Messiah. And so, of course, the rabbis had fun with this one. Is this a funny sidebar, kind of nerd alert note on this? When this passage was translated into Greek, we'll talk about the Greek translation of the Old Testament later in class because it's really important for the New Testament. The term for Cyrus is one letter away, one iota, the I letter, away from Lord. So in some Greek manuscripts, rather than saying his Messiah Cyrus, it says Messiah Lord there. And so if you're a Christian reading this prophecy, let's say a couple hundred years after Jesus, you're reading your Bible in Greek because that's what language you speak. It's very natural then to interpret this passage as being directly about Jesus because it's Lord Messiah, right? So it's interesting. Kuros and kurios, one I. Anyway, kind of nerdy, but it's a fun little aside. Okay, so this is Cyrus. So he is the reason why Israel comes back to the land. Okay, so they come back to the land, and this leads to what we call the Second Temple period. This is the historical period that is most important for understanding the New Testament. Remember, the temple is God's palace. This is where God lives as king among his people. Okay, so when it was destroyed in 586, Jeremiah, the second prophet that we have, major prophet, he said, okay, this exile is going to last for 70 years. And about 70 years later is when we have the consecration of the Second Temple. You can read about this and the struggle for it in some of the historical books like Ezra, Nehemiah, talk about some of the time period, some of this time period. The prophet Haggai is also another good source for this time period. He talks about the struggle for the temple to be built. People are living in their nice homes, and yet God's house sits in shambles. So there was a kind of a struggle to rebuild, struggle internally among the people, struggle with some of the other people who are living in the land, tensions. But it is rebuilt and consecrated again around 515. The period officially ends, Second Temple period, in 70 AD, when Rome destroys the temple. So the temple was destroyed in 70. This is a major event for the New Testament. The Gospels Jesus talks about the destruction of the temple. It's a major cataclysmic event in the same way that the destruction of the first temple was. So that's the period that we're looking at. The latter part of this period is the most important for us because that's really what frames up the time period around the life of Jesus. And so we're going to focus in on that. A couple big points here. One is the cultural point. So I want to talk a little bit about the importance of Hellenism. Hellenism is Greek culture. Greek culture. The term Greek was actually invented by the Romans and later taken over by the people from that region. But the region is Helle, and so that's where we get the term Hellenism from. It's Greek culture. So I want to take us through why Greek culture was spread and why that's important for the New Testament. By the way, what language was the New Testament written in?
King James.
King James English. Maury, for the win.
Maury.
No, who knows? What language was the New Testament written in?
Greek.
Greek? Yeah, all Greek. Isn't that interesting? So the Old Testament is written in mostly Hebrew with some Aramaic. Why all of a sudden are we writing all of our sacred texts in Greek? Because of Hellenism, right? So we want to talk about the importance of that, why that's the case. And also, so I'll take us through that. As they come back into the land, it's also really important to recognize that the formation of Jewish identity, the Jewish identity that's going to be present in the first century when Jesus is around, is beginning to form in this period. It's forming in light of exile and coming back into the land. It's forming around the Second Temple. It's also forming around these cultural struggles, right? So one way to think about the Jewish people as being under the thumb of different empires and kind of struggling to articulate their identity, as well as in the land and outside of the land, right? So many Jews in this period are not living in Palestine, that region. They're living in places like Babylon. Some stayed in Babylon. They're living in places like Alexandria, Egypt, and other places. So they're learning to live and rub shoulders up with people that worship many other gods and have their own rituals. So they're thinking about, okay, what does it mean to be Jewish, right? that's the question that's really coming up in this period. And what does it mean to be Jewish when people are trying to wipe us out, right? So one of the things that we see in Hellenistic culture and within certain empires, we'll talk about Antiochus here in the moment, are certain challenges to the Jewish people, right? We don't want you to be distinct. We don't want you to worship one God, right? That makes you antisocial. That makes you an atheist, actually. Jews and Christians were atheists well before Darwin's acolytes came on the scene, right? We're the OG original atheists, right? That is to say, those who refuse to worship the gods, right? And that's a very kind of antisocial behavior. So Jews have to kind of carve out and navigate their way in the ancient world, right? But some of this is actually good. Didn't the prophets talk about you're going to be a light to the nations, right? And Yahweh's instruction or his Torah is going to be dispersed throughout the nation. So you have things like synagogues, houses of prayer popping up, study centers popping up throughout the ancient world. And by the way, part of the reason that Christianity or the Jesus movement spread so seamlessly in the book of Acts is because Jews have been living among their pagan neighbors in many different places. And people are interested in the God of Israel, right? We'll see in Acts, there's a consistent pattern. They always go to the synagogue or the house of prayer. And out of that, people attach to a house church in that area, some of whom are Jewish, others are Gentile. Luke calls them God-fearers. That word just means pious, like they acknowledge the Jewish God, or maybe they are a proselyte. That is to say, they were a Gentile, born a Gentile, but they converted fully to Judaism. They went through a ritual, which for men would mean circumcision, right? Okay. So we'll talk more about some of the things that make up Jewish identity, but some things to keep in mind that are really critical, right? Being zealous or following the law. Well, part of what comes out from that is groups that are trying to make sure you can't follow the law. Right? You see, so when you're kind of a minority group living among, right, you're fighting for your own identity. So sometimes I think one of the points that I want to make is I think sometimes in the church, we read Jewish literature, which is really our Bible is Jewish literature, right? We receive it through Jesus, the Jewish Messiah. We read Jewish literature and sometimes we see kind of like an inward mentality, right? And it's easy to think, wow, the Jews were kind of ethnocentric, right? Centered on themselves. But one thing to keep in mind about that is there's some aspects of that are true. I mean, every culture has its propensity to be ethnocentric, right? But rather than thinking about them in terms of like how we think of a majority culture that maybe has elements of racism or prejudice in it, it's better to think of them as a minority culture trying to survive in a world of where they're being oppressed, right? So it's kind of like a better comparison would be looking at a minority group in a majority culture and how they operate and move. That would be a better comparison when we're mentally thinking about how Jews deal with Gentiles, right? Outsiders. And there are a variety of ways that Jews approached outsiders. From some Jews that said, have nothing to do with outsiders. That's one way of going about it. And we see a little bit of that in Peter in Acts when he says, it's not right for us, it's not even permissible for us to enter into your house, Cornelius, right? Because you're a Gentile. There's some that are very extreme on that end, but you have a spectrum all the way to, hey, if you're interested in honoring the one God, you can be Gentile, we can live together, we can be good neighbors, very accommodating, right? So there's not one way for Jews to engage with Gentiles, but part of what's being kind of figured out in this time period is different groups are responding in different ways. But part of that response, as we'll get into, is in light of persecution and different things that happen, okay? And then the navigating of empire. So we talked about the Persians briefly. They're responsible for Israel coming back or Judah coming back to the land. And Judah for a while was a Persian province, right, of a province of the Persian Empire. But the next phase in the kind of sequence of empires are the Greeks, right? And one figure in particular, Alexander the Great, right? Maybe some of you have heard of him.
Yeah.
Lover of Greek culture and of conquering the world, right? And he did both. He went and he conquered a massive amount of territory. I'm going to show you here on a map, just so you can visually see on our map here. So he was a Macedonian, right? Macedon is up here, kind of northern Greece, right? We're going to encounter Macedon when we get into the New Testament. Philippi is a major city in Macedonia. So at the time that Alexander was around, the Macedonians really loved Greek culture. His father, Philip, he got Aristotle to tutor Alexander, Aristotle, the great philosopher. And they loved Greek culture, but the people that lived down in Greece or in Attica and other places, they did not really see the Macedonians as being fully Greek. But in any case, Alexander had these great ambitions to rule the world. And you can see he took basically all the way up to India, the Indus River here. He conquered what was probably from his perspective, basically all of the known world. And as legend goes, when he reached the end, he wept because there was no world left to conquer. Right? So very young, he did this in like his very early 20s. He conquers the world and then he dies. But the way he envisioned kind of uniting this whole space, you can see a massive amount of different cultures. Here's down in Egypt. Here's like Syria, so Israel, right? We're talking about this space for Judea, was through Greek culture, right? So as a result of Alexander, Greek and Greek culture becomes the thing that unites all these different people groups together. It becomes the lingua franca, or the common language. So if you want to communicate cross-culturally, let's say you have an important message you want to send, or an inscription you want to put up in a city, you're going to do it in Greek, right? If you want to establish yourself as being learned, or kind of raise the prestige of your city, you're going to do Greek things, right? And so that's what we mean by Hellenism. And the influence of Hellenic culture is this kind of seeps through this entire region, including the areas where you have Jews living throughout, right? Jews are living all over the place here, down here, but also even Jews in Palestine, right? So even somebody like Jesus of Nazareth, whose native tongue would have been Aramaic, right? And would have known Hebrew for reading the scriptures, even someone like Jesus and his companions in Galilee likely would have spoken some Greek, right? Just speaking probabilistically, right? Given how much Greek is in the area. There is the famous New Testament scholar Martin Hengel, German, he says something to the effect of, there is no Judaism without Hellenism after the spread of Hellenism, because the ways in which these things come together influence and inform one another. Even Jewish texts what's really ironic is there's some Jewish texts that are very antagonistic towards Hellenistic culture, and they actually are the most Hellenistic of all the texts, which is very interesting. It's like, we're going to be, okay, so you think, Plato is the font of all wisdom. Well, let me tell you, Plato just ripped off Moses, right? You get that kind of a thing going on, right? So that's what we mean. So this is the area that Alexander conquers and kind of the influence of Hellenism. I want to talk really briefly about the Hellenistic period and some of the important facets of that, what happens. Like I said, Alexander conquers the world and then dies, and he leaves his empire to his successors. The Greek term is diadokoi. The two most important for studying the Bible are, one of the generals is named Ptolemy. The Ptolemaic Empire, it sets up in Egypt, but it also runs all the way up into the land of Palestine, and the Seleucids, So these are two, Seleucus and Ptolemy are two of his generals, and their empires are below and above the Holy Land, and they're going to fight over that area. So originally that territory went to Ptolemy, and eventually it goes to the Seleucid Empire. And the key kind of bad figure within the Jewish history of this period, we have hints of him in the book of Daniel. All right. I'll mention a couple texts there. The primary sources for learning about this guy, though, are in the book of Maccabees, the first Maccabees in particular. We get some of him in second Maccabees as well. I'll talk about these books more a little bit later. I have a handout for you to kind of explain where they came from. But essentially, it's a Jewish history written around the time period of this guy just after. And then our other source who relies on some of these earlier sources as well is a guy named Josephus, who lives about a generation after Jesus, a Jewish historian. So we know a lot about Antiochus and his whole deal from these sources, and we get hints about him in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. So in Daniel chapter 7, verse 8, this is a very important passage for the New Testament. Daniel 7 is a chapter about 4 beasts that come out of the sea, and the last beast is the worst. In fact, the first 3 are compared to animals. The 4th is so terrifying, he doesn't even dare compare it to an animal. And there's a horn that comes out of that beast that speaks blasphemous things. This is an allusion to this king, Antiochus Epiphanes. Another vision in Daniel 9, there is an instance where he uses the language of a desolating abomination, or an abomination of desolation that happens in the temple in 927. We know in more detail about this event from this passage in First Maccabees, as well as from Josephus. What happened was Antiochus came in and he desecrated the temple. Inside the temple, there's an altar of burnt offering. That's the primary altar that's used on a day-to-day basis to present sacrifices. On top of this altar, he erected a statue of Zeus and slaughtered a pig and splattered pig's blood, pigs being the most unclean animal. So it's basically the most insulting, defiling thing you could do to the temple. He did that very intentionally. And we read in the Maccabean literature, he went about a program of trying to go at what were perceived to be kind of the core of Jewish identity. So what are the things he says they can't do? They can't follow the law of Moses. They can't honor the Sabbath. They can't circumcise their sons, right? These are the kind of core things that he says, we're going to make sure that Jewish people can't do that anymore. And it's all in the name of, in his kind of making us all one people, right? Tyrants and autocrats always want to do that, right? They claim to unify all people by wiping out their particular things, right? We'll make you in our image and we'll be unified. You're welcome, right? That was kind of what Antiochus wanted to do. And so the Jewish people are going to react to that. Yeah.
Do you have a year?
Oh, the exact year. Yes, it was winter of 167 that the temple was desecrated. What happens is this launches a revolt. Some Jews take up arms against the Seleucids. There's a variety of different responses. Some are perfectly fine with the program of Hellenization. It says that in the Maccabean literature. Others went for a kind of nonviolent protest. I think that's kind of the position we see in Daniel. In Maccabees, it's a group is actually going to fight for us. They're going to take up arms against the Seleucids. And the most famous one is the guy we know, Judah Maccabee. The term probably comes from an Aramaic term meaning hammer. So it's not, it's like Judah the hammer, right? Like you're sending in Rambo to fight for you. It's kind of the idea, right? Like picture like I don't know, Arnold Schwarzenegger or Sylvester Stallone, walking in. Probably didn't have a shirt off in this case, but they were armed, right? So they begin to launch guerrilla warfare against Antiochus and the Seleucids, and it's pretty improbable, but they actually push them back out of the land. And it takes some time, but in 3 years from when it was desecrated, they rededicate the temple to the Lord. And, growing up Jewish, this is one of the holidays I always celebrated, Hanukkah, right? The term Hanukkah means dedication. So it's the rededicating of the temple to the Lord. We see Jesus celebrating Hanukkah in John's gospel. When he goes there, Hanukkah is, of course, about lights. And he says, I am the light of the world, right? So this becomes a really important moment in Jewish history. This becomes the first time where we have a kingdom that's ran by Jews, right? The Maccabees, again, they kind of take on this name. They're also known as the Hasmoneans. So if you ever see that term, the Maccabees are the Hasmoneans, or the Hasmoneans are the descendants of Judah, right, and his brothers. They were priests, so they come on as priests, and eventually they take on the title of king as well. So now you have, for the first time since the Babylonian exile, you actually have a Jewish kingdom, right? Jews running the land. And some of the Maccabean literature suggests that they are kind of like the successors to David and David's kingdom. Maybe not quite as good, but darn well close, or about as close as you can get in that period, right? So this is a very important moment. But again, you can see in the way that they rule, and that it's very much kind of in the style of the Hellenistic kingship. And so it's not like it's, and if have you read the books of the Kings, you can see that among the smattering of good kings, there tends to be a lot of bad kings. So a number of these guys aren't so great in terms of how they rule. But this is important period in the Second Temple period, where there's Jewish rule in the land. It's at this time period we also begin to see the emergence of a couple of important groups that you'll see mentioned in the New Testament. So I'll just touch on them very briefly here. The Pharisees and the Sadducees are the two groups that we see mentioned in the New Testament, and it's around this period where they show up. So when I say Pharisee, what are you thinking?
Arrogant.
Who wants to be called a Pharisee?
Nobody.
Typically not, right?
No.
We in the church, we tend to have a very stilted kind of almost caricature kind of picture of the Pharisees. And part of that's because we have texts in the New Testament that are kind of using the Pharisee as a type, right? In the same way that we might say, well, we know pastors are like X or something like that, right? So some of that is
Pastors' kids.
or pastors' kids. Yeah, PKs are like this, right?
Exactly.
So some of it is, is from our tradition, but it's also because we only have partial pictures, or we haven't read very closely about the Pharisees. For example, did you know that there were Christ-following Pharisees? All right, we see that very clearly in the book of Acts. In fact, at the Jerusalem Council, it mentions it explicitly, there are Pharisees who are following Jesus, right? Many of the things the Pharisees believed, Jesus believed, which is why they argue so much. Right? It's like arguing with your sibling, right? Joe down the street who has nothing in common with your family and your story, you don't even talk to Joe, because what are you going to talk about? But, Bob, your brother, right, your cousin, right? Well, you both have this family legacy history that you think is really important to get right. So you're going to argue about it, right? That's why Jesus and the Pharisees get into it a lot. So we see this group, the Pharisees, emerge. Not exactly clear how these groups or exactly when they began, but we see the Pharisees and the Sadducees. In a nutshell, the Pharisees are we could think of them as kind of a holiness group, a holiness movement, right? And teachers of the law. By holiness, I mean that they seem to have taken some of the ideas of consecration for the accoutrement in the temple, like the states in which a priest might be, and brought that into the house. So a kind of bringing of the temple, in a sense, into the house, right? You can find that in the New Testament as well. They're meeting in houses together. We're the temple of God, right? So it's not a crazy idea by any stretch, but they take certain ritual washings and things like this seriously when they're eating what would be common food. That is to say, not food that's necessarily set apart for holy purpose. So being interested in these kind of things. They were also identified as being the primary teachers throughout the area. You'll notice that when you read the Gospels, the Pharisees aren't just in Jerusalem, they're everywhere. They're in Galilee, right? And in other places, because these are kind of established teachers of the law, experts in the law of Moses. So they're known for that. Another thing they're known for that they agree with, the early Christians agree with, is bodily resurrection. What is resurrection? It's kind of a crazy idea if you just think about it, right? It's so central to our faith. It's everything, right? If there is no resurrection, Paul says that we are to be pitied above all because we're still in our sins, right? So resurrection, the idea that God can raise, reconstitute, and glorify mortal bodies, right, is this idea that becomes central for some Jewish groups of the period. And in part, it has to do with justice. Right? One of the questions in the Bible, the Old Testament, is why do bad things keep happening to good people? And why do the tyrants and the rich and the oppressors seem to be doing so well? Right? If God is a God of justice, it doesn't seem like those things always get worked out in this life, right? So maybe there is something more ultimate. So in part, resurrection kind of answers to and speaks to that question, right? So in 2 Maccabees, the second book of Maccabees, different one. This is you have a scene where a Jewish mother is there with her 7 sons, and they're all being martyred. They're being tortured and dismembered, and they keep saying to the pagan tyrant, "You can do whatever you want to my body. My God has the power to raise me from the dead and put it all back together again. What are you going to say to my God when you see him?" Right? So you see this idea of resurrection very strongly articulated in these contexts, right? About justice, about kind of God's finally putting everything right, setting everything right. So the Pharisees were big into bodily resurrection, and that's something that they agree with. The early Christian group agrees with the Pharisees on. The Sadducees are a bit different. They are a priestly aristocratic group that are tied, their power is tied to the temple in Jerusalem. So they're part of priestly families. You have the council, or the Sanhedrin, which is kind of like the official council, is made up of priests, some of whom are Sadducees, as well as some Pharisees. But the Sadducees in particular are tied to priestly families, tied to the temple. So when the temple is destroyed, we don't really see much of the Sadducees carry on in Jewish history. They also are a bit different. So they're known for denying bodily resurrection. Their view of the afterlife isn't entirely clear, other than what they deny. So their view of the afterlife might have been something like, you live on through the memory of your descendants, right? Which is actually a pretty common way of thinking about it in the ancient world. And you could arrive at that pretty naturally from parts of the Old Testament. So they probably have a kind of more conservative view, if you like. They don't see resurrection clearly, so they kind of hold to that. They didn't have as many scriptures as the Pharisees. They seem to be more interested strictly in the first 5 books of Moses, or the Pentateuch. So that, I mentioned kind of their location. So we see them show up in the New Testament when Jesus and his followers are in Jerusalem, nowhere else. And we also see them show up around debates of resurrection because they're known for doubting the resurrection or for denying it.
Did they believe in an afterlife at all? Or?
So our only source on what they believed is Josephus, okay? And Josephus was writing for a pagan audience, so he's translating the beliefs of these groups for a broader pagan audience. So he presents the Sadducees as kind of like Epicureans of the day who are kind of these wise teachers. They don't really have much of a sense of the afterlife. It's more about, free will, what you do now. What Josephus says is they deny the persistence of the psyche, which is your soul, or the thing that emanates the body, right? So when you die and your body decays, if the psyche lives on, your soul, it can be reconnected with body, right? But they deny that persists after life, right? So their view of the afterlife is probably something like the idea that you find in Jewish and other texts, or some Jewish and other texts, that you live on through the memory of your descendants, right? Which is why having descendants is so critical for ancient peoples, right? Because if your descendants are cut off, that's your name, your legacy, everything. That's how you would live on, through the impact that you leave on your descendants. But that's probably what they believe. We don't know for sure. Yeah. So that's the Sadducees. If you need a fancy mnemonic device to remember them, you may have heard this before. They denied the resurrection, so they were sad, you see. Yeah. It's so corny, but it helps it stick for people in their mind when they're thinking about, wait, which is that group that denies the resurrection? Oh, yeah, the sad ones, right? Yeah, okay, Sadducees. So, yeah, exactly. The other group that's mentioned, I'll just touch on them very briefly. We don't see them in the New Testament, and happy to discuss this with you outside of class too, because it's so important for our understanding of the period. This group called the Essenes, they're called such in writers like Josephus and some other groups, but prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, these are scrolls that we found around the Dead Sea, the northwest shore of the Dead Sea, in caves. It's a crazy story. The first scroll was discovered in 1947 when a Bedouin shepherd was out with the flock, throws a rock into a cave, as one does when you're tending to your sheep, and he hears a crack and thinks, okay, I'll go into that cave. I don't know, my first instinct isn't always just to go into a random cave when I hear a noise, probably keep going with the sheep, but he goes into the cave and he finds that this urn had been broken, which was housing scrolls. This was the first cave of 11 caves that were subsequently discovered, containing our oldest copies of the Old Testament, not just by like a few years, oldest by over 1,000 years. All right. So copies of the Old Testament, copies of other books of the Bible, and copies of other texts that they had written for their community, like a community rule. How do we live together? What do we do when we eat? These kind of things. So our understanding of the Judaism of that time period greatly expanded, right? We realized it was even more diverse than we thought, but we also had now archaeological evidence to kind of tie this group called Essenes by Josephus and others. We were like, oh, okay, that's the group that lives there. That's the dominant hypothesis, that this Essene group that Josephus discussed, kind of a sectarian group living in the Dead Sea, that's that group. We never see them mentioned in the New Testament, but very important for our understanding of the period, very important for our Bibles, because we have copies, for example, the Great Isaiah Scroll, one of the most important discoveries, almost a completely intact copy of Isaiah, which agrees for the most part almost completely with the version of Isaiah we have in our Hebrew text from 1,000 years later, the medieval period. So really, really cool stuff. The Dead Sea Scrolls are so fun. I wish we could just go on and on about them, but that's
that could be a whole class.
It could be. It really could. Yeah.
Do we know the meaning of the word Essene?
Not exactly. We've guessed on that. There's a couple guesses. Philo, I believe, gives a guess on it as being something to do with like holy. They try to make connections with the name. We don't know for sure exactly where it comes from, but I believe it's Philo who tries to connect it to in some way to holiness. I can look up the reference for you for next week, though. Yeah. That's not how they refer to themselves in their own literature, which we have from the caves. They refer to themselves as the Yahad, like the community group. They call themselves the Sons of Light.
So they were very
like
humble.
Very humble. Oh, and what's really funny about this group, okay, so this blew my mind when I first learned this. I've got to share this. So they actually have veiled references to the Pharisees in some of their texts. They wrote a commentary on the book of Nahum, or Nahum, right? Called the Nahum Pesher, which is, the way to think about it is, a Pesher is like a commentary on every line of the Bible, where rather than, they're not interpreting it like, I think Nahum meant this in his time. No, they're interpreting every line with direct relevance and immediacy to their cultural moment. Okay. So they mention the slaughtering of this group by a wicked king. This king happened to be one of the Hasmoneans, Alexander Eunaeus. He crucified some 700 Pharisees. Right? Yeah, very brutal guy. Well, they mentioned this unfortunate thing that happens to this group, and they refer to them, get this, as the seekers of smooth things. In other words, for this group, the Pharisees were the softies, the liberals, right? The easygoing, the ones that seek easy interpretations of the Bible. So put that in your pipe and smoke it. The Pharisees were the liberals.
The sissies.
Yeah, they were the easygoing ones, right? So yeah, it puts things in perspective, right? Okay, the last group, just very, very briefly mentioned, the Zealots. Josephus kind of tags them on in his mentioning of these four groups as a fourth school, not as a legitimate philosophy, because he actually blames this group for the whole war against Rome and everything. But this is a group that he says they agree in theology with the Pharisees, but the major caveat is they're not happy to have anyone else as their king. In other words, they're willing to take up arms and fight, right? And where they show up in Josephus's narrative is with the instantiation of the temple, or the tributary tax to Rome. Rome actually made a pretty sweet deal with the Jewish people. You can worship your God in your temple. We won't infringe upon that. Rome was very, very nice, right? That's kind of imperial talk, but from their perspective, I would say they probably thought they were very nice to the Jewish people. They needed that land to be pacified, no war, because their major supplier of corn was in Egypt, and you come through that area, port city, and then set out for sea. So it behooved them for that area to be very happy. So they were very, probably in a condescending way, but very kind to the Jews, right? So they made a deal with them. Yeah, you can worship your God. You don't even have to worship the emperor. Just pray for the emperor. You don't have to pray to the emperor. Pray for the emperor. So they did. And so you have this kind of setup. But and one thing we do ask is that you pay this tributary tax, right? So when the Romans established that, there was a guy by the name of Judas the Galilean, Josephus mentions him, that took up arms, and there was a big riot and a bunch of deaths, right? Why that might be important for understanding the New Testament? Well, there's that scene in the Gospels where Jesus is in the temple and the Pharisees are trying to catch him in a trap. And they ask him, should we pay taxes to Caesar? And us being good Westerners, right? We think, well, this is a classic case of a separation of church and state, right? Render unto Caesar. No, that's not their framework, right? They're trying to say, is God king or not? Right. And if he is, shouldn't we then take up arms? Right. They're kind of trying to goad Jesus right there. You see, at knowing that this whole thing actually had in the past caused people to take up arms already. Right. So maybe we can get back to that text. I'll tease that a little bit. We can think more about what you make of that text next week. We can get into the Gospels. But that's an example of where that sheds light. One of Jesus's disciples, one of the 12, is a guy Luke tells us his name was Simon the Zealot. All right. And it could be that the term zealot just was a reference to zealous for, the traditions of his ancestors, law of Moses. That's possible. Could also be that he was actually a zealot, a member of this party that came and joined Jesus, right? Anyway, so it adds a little color to the Bible when you're reading. You see Simon the Zealot. Okay, so that's a little bit about some of these groups, some of which we see pop up pretty prominently, others that aren't mentioned, but they're there in the background. Okay, so let's see here.
Up till 9:30, whatever.
No problem. We have 8:30, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. It should be.
That's an hour fast.
I know, yes.
I've got. Okay, so I want to mention a little bit now about Rome, and this is now getting into the direct picture of the scene, like when Jesus comes on the scene, what's going on. So Herod the Great, you'll know him from your Bibles, from the Gospel of Matthew. Again, that's the first book of our New Testament. The Herod that's mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew, who's worried about another king, is this guy, Herod the Great, one of the shrewdest political operators in the ancient world. Really, actually, if you just kind of look at what he did, he's pretty genius, pretty astute political operator. He got in really good with the Romans and was declared king of the Jews by Caesar Augustus, the first Roman emperor. That was in 37 BC. I should mention that the period of the Hasmonean rule ended officially in 63 BC, when the Roman general Pompey came in and stormed into Jerusalem, actually came into the temple and slaughtered priests and all this kind of a thing. But from that period on, Judea was under the auspices of the Roman Empire, right? So basically Rome is choosing the king. This guy, Herod, is going to be the king of the Jews. Even though he is not actually Jew, he's a Jew. He's an Idumean, which is related to the people from Esau, the brother of Jacob, we know from the Old Testament. And so not seen as really being fully Jewish, but he's the guy that's installed as the king of the Jews in 37. And we see him right at the end of his life in the Gospel of Matthew. He kind of comes off as paranoid and senile a little bit, or like, killing off a bunch of people. That matches actually pretty well what we see in Josephus as well, that later in life, he kind of becomes paranoid and starts killing off a bunch of people. Nobody's spared. He kills one of his wives and all kinds of stuff. Not a great guy, but again, very shrewd political operator. The way to think about Herod's agenda is he wanted to make Judea great again, right? And I know we know that slogan now in our own country, but I think it's actually a really helpful way of thinking about what he was up to, because he's drawing back on the great golden age of Israel, the monarchy, when David and David's son Solomon reigned. And Herod knew, all right, I'm not a son of David. In fact, I'm not even really a Jew, but what if I did everything that Solomon did and even one-upped him, right? What if I made Judea great again? Wouldn't I then be this great king? So that's kind of what he does. He tries to relive. He builds a monument to David, which is very strategic, because in Hellenistic culture, to do that, to build the monument, you're saying that I'm in the succession in the line of that person. So it's not just like for antiquarian purposes, I'm putting up this monument at the tomb of David. I'm putting this up. That's me stating that I'll take it from here, kind of thing, right? I'm carrying this forward. What did Solomon do? Solomon built the temple. Okay, well, there's a second temple there, but Herod thought, well, I'll just keep adding to the temple. I'll make it bigger and better. He made the temple bigger and better than it had ever been, like kept expanding, wider, bigger, greater. He also strategically built, I'll show you some pictures, strategically built temples to Caesar. The god Caesar Augustus and the goddess Roma being the kind of embodiment of Roman imperial power. And he put those in strategic places that would be least likely to offend the Jewish people of the area, but would present this area as being really important in the Roman Empire to everybody else, right? So by doing all this, right, he's establishing himself as this great king and ruler. So I think it's a helpful way of thinking about it. I'll show you some pictures here in a moment. But when Herod died, his sons, his empire was divided up. Okay, so you think early on in the Gospels, at the birth of Jesus, Herod is the old wicked king, right? That was killing off young Jewish boys. But he dies, right? And then his kingdom is divided. His oldest son, Archelaus, was given kind of the main area, Judea, Samaria, up north of Judea, and Idumea, which was just south. Antipas, his other son, is given Galilee. So when you read in your Gospels of a Herod, it's Herod Antipas in Galilee. This is the area where Jesus lived. This is the Antipas the Herod Antipas that we see mentioned in the Gospels in Jesus's home area. And then his brother Philip had the regions to the east. John the Baptist was killed because he protested that Herod Antipas took Philip's wife as his own. He protests that. And so his wife, Herodias, and her daughter, right, she does that dance. I don't know, it must have been a very persuasive dance because it leads him to say, whatever you want, you got it. And she says, give me the head of John the Baptist on a silver platter. Right. So this is the prime guy that we're going to see in the Gospels after Herod dies. But you might be asking yourself, well, what the heck happened to Archelaus? Basically, this guy was a horrible ruler. He couldn't get his stuff together. Classic example of the oldest son, right? He's in line to the throne. He's got everything handed to him, but he's just not the operative his dad was. Can't keep the people under control. Augustus has to come in and say, you're out, buddy. We're sending you off. Have you heard of this place called Gaul? It's really wonderful in the springtime. So he sends him off, and Judea becomes a Roman province from this period onward under the oversight of a Roman governor or prefect. The prefect that we encounter in the Gospels is Pontius Pilate, right? And we have inscriptions that say Pilatus Praefectus, right? Pilate prefect. So he was the governor of that period. His headquarters would not actually have been in Jerusalem, but rather on the coast. However, at important festivals, places where the people might be likely to riot or you have large crowds, you'd have a larger presence there as a kind of crowd control, if you like. And so we see Pilate there at Passover time, for example, to kind of keep things in order. All right. So these are some of the players that we see in the Gospels, Herod and his family. You'll meet in the Gospels a group called the Herodians, right? This is a way of designating a group that is loyal to Herod and his family. That suffix "ian," which, by the way, we have it in Christian as well, don't we? Christian, Herodian. It comes from a Latin suffix, "ianos," which is taken over into Greek. It means partisan of or follower of whoever you put first. So you can have Caesarians or Caesarians, loyalists to Caesar, Herodians, loyalists to Herod and his family, and the term as it develops, Christians, those who are loyalists or followers of a figure called Christ. Right? It's not the first name that Christians have, but eventually it's a name that's either probably given to them at first, a way of identifying this group who follows a figure called Christ, right? Okay, so let's look at a couple pictures. This is a model of the temple. Herod started work on this in 20 BC. Work on the temple, especially the outer areas and things like this, continued on to 63. So almost up to its destruction, it was under construction in some way, form or fashion, being built on, being expanded. The main area is, of course, the inner part where you have the altar of burnt offering, and then in the inner compartment, the altar of incense, and then in the Holy of Holies, the holiest place, is the place where God's presence dwells. Massive building.
What were those rooms around the outside?
Yeah,
Animals?
I don't go back, but places like for priests to change and things like that, probably like different areas. Like you'd have to wash and change into the appropriate dress to perform the priestly duty. There was also a Fortress Antonia connected to the temple, where arms were stored, and Roman soldiers could be posted for big events and things like that. So Herod is the king of the Jews. He's under Rome. Herod and all his kids were trained in Rome. So Rome, real briefly, how did they see themselves? Just a couple points. As all good empires do, they saw it as their mission was to bring justice and virtue to the world, here rooted in their very Romanness, Romanitas. So we might have heard of the term Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. They brought peace to the world through conquering the world.
Through death.
Through death, peace through death, right? We kill you, we conquer you, and that's that. They did see spreading of Greek culture as something distinctive to them. So Augustus is praised. Philo, a Jewish writer, praises Caesar Augustus for spreading peace, right? And making many Greeks of the world, making many Greeces or Helleni of the world, right? So the spreading of Greek culture is very important to the Romans as well. Sophistication, all these kind of things, right? But rooted in them bringing justice and virtue to the barbarian world. The emperor Augustus, Octavian, was the first emperor. He became known as the first of many sons of God, right? So the emperor was called the Son of God, and seen as the ruler of the world. So like Lord of the world, Son of God, these are terms used for the Roman emperor, right? Those probably sound familiar to us as Christians as well, right? We worship a certain Son of God, Jesus. We call him Lord of the world. So when you think about the political environment of the New Testament, declaring Jesus the Son of God, he is Kurios, or Lord of the world. These are terms that have wider political resonance of that period. They're not, as we think of it, strictly spiritual terms or religious terms. Religion, politics, it's all kind of networked together, right? And so there's a political stance in calling Jesus the Son of God, rather than, let's say, the Roman emperor. Yeah.
Would you speculate that if that Augustus had not been called Son of God, Jesus would not have been?
No, he still would, because it's not just tied to Rome, right? So Son of God language is also rooted in Messianic language in the Old Testament.
But not in the Old Testament, is it?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Some of the key texts, actually. So Psalm 2:7, when the king is anointed, God says to him, "You are my son. This day I have begotten you." That's a key one. There's a couple others. That's the main one that comes to mind. But yeah, Son of God is language that you find
Psalm
for
89.
kings. Psalm 89.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh, another one. Yeah. I will call on God as Father, right? So there's the king calls God Father. It's definitely rooted in royal language more broadly. It's not particular necessarily to the Roman Empire. The reason why Roman emperors are called Son of God is a little bit distinct in that Augustus, for political reasons, has his father, Julius Caesar, his adopted father, deified, meaning when he dies, he's recognized as a god, and that allows him to claim himself as son of God when he's trying to become the emperor, the main ruler of the period. And that starts a tradition where thereafter every Roman Empire is known as Son of God, right? So there's some overlap there, right? In terms of son of God language isn't distinct to Roman politics. You see it more broadly, but certainly in this period, it was an important feature. And we see the presence of Rome throughout the ancient world with temples, statues, inscriptions, coins, right? Believe it or not, money is a primary source of political messaging and propaganda in the ancient world. In fact, if you ever inspected our money in this country very closely, you might recognize there's not that big of a difference in some ways. We have a lot of political messaging in our money as well, and there's a history behind each of those things. But all of these things are to make Rome and make the emperor's presence in some ways omnipresent throughout parts of the ancient world. So now we can look at a couple of pictures. So this is what Herod did. You had here, this is in Caesarea Maritime, very close to where, just a couple miles away from where Peter confesses Jesus to be the Messiah when they're traveling south. They're close to this area. This was a temple that was already built to the god Pan. That word just means all. And so what Herod did was he built next to this a temple to Caesar Augustus and the goddess Roma. The two are together. And this was a major site that kind of brought prestige to the area. So this is just a kind of sketch. This is an actual shot of the area now, right? You can see here ships would come into the harbor here, right? It's like, think about it this way. It'd be like coming into a town and seeing a massive billboard about what that town is all about. We're the greatest, I don't know, think about like Reno, the biggest little city on earth, or, whatever but this is like massive temple. Wow, this is an important area, right? And this is a harbor where ships would be coming from Rome, other places, bringing goods in and out, major harbor area. So this was very strategic on the part of Herod. Looks really good for him and brings prestige to his area. All right, we're thinking about coins. I mentioned the coin earlier. This is just one example of the money, right? Money tells a story of who's in charge, who's important. So every time you look at money in this period, typically you're going to see the inscription or image of the emperor. Where Jesus asks, well, whose image, whose inscription? Caesar's, they say, right? So this is the face, the image of Tiberius Caesar. I chose this one because he's the emperor during the lifetime of Jesus. So it's plausible that when Jesus is looking at the coin in the temple with them, this is the kind of image they would see. Around the outside, it says his name. It's abbreviated, but it's Tiberius Caesar, son of God, Augustus, right, throughout the outside. And then on the other side, you can see he's dressed in a kind of royal, priestly, like official priestly attire. And you can see this one's a little clearer to read. It says Pontiff Maxim. Anyone want to play? What's that game where you fill in with Vanna White and stuff? You fill in the letters. Wheel of Fortune, right?
Wheel of Fortune.
Yeah, let's play Wheel of Fortune. Pontiff Maxim. What do you think it's what's short for?
Sounds like Heavenly Father.
Okay, it's Pontifex Maximus, high priest. So the emperor was traditionally the high priest, right? But if the name Pontiff sounds familiar to you, you might associate it with the Roman Catholicism. The Pope is called the Pontiff, right? This is because this title is taken over by the Bishop of Rome, the Pontiff, when the Roman Empire becomes the Holy Roman Empire, right? But this is Caesar. Why high priest? Well, it's kind of an official title. It shows his devotion to Roman religion, to the gods, to tradition, right? So he's presented here as the high priest.
Did they have a separate priestly?
They had priestly colleges, yeah, and he was seen as kind of the one that oversees and makes sure everything runs well, right? It's taken care of, funded, all this kind of thing. Interesting, though, the New Testament also has Jesus as king and high priest, right? Probably not necessarily mirroring Rome per se. I mean, it's the issue in Hebrews is Jewish priesthood, but again, another kind of cultural overlap of a ruler who's also high priest. Right, so this gives you a picture a little bit.
Max, during this time,
Yeah.
was there any kind of education for the common people?
Oh, yeah. Okay, so great
What
question.
did that look like?
What did it look like? Yeah. So it kind of depends culturally on, where you're looking at, right? But they did have a kind of general curricular education that certain people would have access to. Not everybody, but some. So Paul likely would be somebody that would fall into this camp, a reading and writing kind of a thing. And then there's sort of that level. And then there's like the high level, right? Where the elite of the elite do this kind of, the people that could write massive texts and read, in that kind of a way. And that we're talking there a very, very small percentage of people. But in terms of like the Jewish people, there would be a kind of literacy through memorization of scripture, desire to read Hebrew to engage with the scriptures. But also textual engagement wouldn't just be through reading, but also hearing it, right? So your encounter with the text of the Bible as we have it today would be through your ears, hearing it and learning it, and memorizing it and taking it in. So yeah, there absolutely was education. Most of it was kind of functionally driven. Like we're thinking about the masses, we're thinking of people that would be probably by our standards, illiterate, meaning people that couldn't just pick up a large book like this and start reading it, but they had a kind of literacy for their period that worked for them, right? They could write a business contract. They could read an inscription, right? Saying something important, those kind of things, right? But if literacy is just defined in terms of like, someone that can produce like a massive text, then you're talking about maybe 5% of the population or less, right? But if you look at a kind of functional literacy, ability to read a little bit, maybe write a little bit, or interact with stories that are common to culture and these kind of a thing, then most of the population would fall into that in some form or fashion, right? And we know this because we have a lot of contracts from business contracts that have been written, in some cases like divorces, divorce contracts, these kind of things, inscriptions. If no one could read the inscription, right, why would they put it up, right? So people could read it, or if you couldn't read it, or you couldn't write, someone else could do it for you, right? So we have some, like a divorce contract or a woman's, like someone else is writing for the woman. And she said, because so-and-so can't write, for example. So there's ways of operating in the world, right? I would describe it as kind of a functional education. Yeah, practical. Yeah.
Why does Jesus condemn or criticize scribes?
Oh, okay. So why does Jesus criticize scribes? I don't think he out and out criticizes scribes. Where we find the tension between Jesus and scribes is on a couple levels. One is on the issue of authority. His authority is juxtaposed to the authority of the scribes because he has a kind of authority that is special, unique, one-off. He's not just a scribe who's learned and who stands in a tradition of other human authorities. He's an authority in a different class. Okay, so that's one way that they're. And then when it comes to interpretation of particular text, sometimes he has it out with other experts around what is a good interpretation of the text. But scribes are not always condemned. For example, in the temple, there's a scribe that asks Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, what's the most important, teaching? Like, what is the law all about? And he asks him, right? Like, well, what do you say? And they go back and forth, and Jesus tells the scribe, okay, it's love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And the scribe says, yeah, you're right in saying these things. And Jesus says to him, well, you're not far from the kingdom of heaven, or kingdom of God, sorry. So it's kind of like, in that case, is a good scribe, right? So you have pictures of that, but they do butt heads because they might be operating by certain interpretive principles. I guess in a nutshell, they don't fully recognize Jesus for who he is. That's like the root issue in the Gospels with some of the scribes that Jesus has it out with. They're not seeing who he is and where his authority comes from.
I run into that all the time.
Yeah. You don't recognize my authority, good sir.
There you go. Thank you.
I realize we're pressed for time, so can I just make a couple comments? And we've covered a lot tonight. I realize that, and so the outlook was too ambitious. So for point number 4, shape of the canon, here I'm just laying out for you the components of the New Testament. These are the things we're going to cover in the next 5 weeks. So I just, you could kind of review that and see what's there. I just thought it'd be helpful for you to have in front of you what our New Testament is made up of. It's 27 books, but these are the categories that they fall into. Okay. When it comes to Israel's scriptures, there's a ton we could say. So that the only thing I will say is, because of time, the key for our understanding of the New Testament, along with our cultural awareness of the period and the kind of stuff we're talking about tonight, is the Old Testament or the scriptures of Israel. These are the stories that inform the New Testament. Right? These are the stories that inform Jesus's mission and vocation, and their interpretation is critical, right? The Old Testament is telling a story about God selecting a people for a purpose, and where is that story headed, right? We're picking up at the kind of climactic moment of that story. The New Testament is suggesting to us that we are at the climax of that story with Jesus. So we're going to be spending a lot of time thinking about the Old Testament because we're reading the New Testament. So we can't not think about the Old Testament. So I'll just put that on your radar. And the other thing just to mention is because of the importance of Israel's scriptures and because the people were scattered throughout and many of them didn't speak Hebrew, they spoke Greek, the Old Testament text began to be translated into Greek. And it can't really stress how critical of a thing this is, this dynamic. The term Septuagint, sometimes used to refer to these Greek texts, or abbreviated LXX, the Roman numeral for 70. These become the scriptures for Jews outside the land, and they become primarily the Old Testament scriptures for the early church, most of whom don't speak Hebrew. So very, very important dynamic that happens here. And then the last thing I'll say is maybe you can look this over, and if you have any questions for me next week, I can briefly address them. But the handout that you have, oh, I see here it's only one-sided. So those in class, I'll give you the other side. I thought it was two-sided. Those of you that have it online, it's 2 pages. I think it's really helpful to see listed here the different Old Testament canons. Protestant Old Testament canon is the same as the Jewish one, except for the way that the books are put together and ordered are different. The Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox canons have more books in them. And these are books that show up in what comes to be known as the Septuagint. The books are sometimes called apocryphal. That's a more negative way of phrasing it, or deuterocanonical from the perspective of Catholic perspective, books that are part of the canon, but not necessarily central, I guess is a way to think about it. So you can review this. You'll notice these different books.
Next, just so you know, the Episcopal Church uses those books as well.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah. Oh, so, okay, great. So you have them in your canon then as deuterocanonical. Yes. Okay. Very good.
So they are indicated as deuterocanonical.
They are.
The 39 articles give a very clear definition of the difference.
Very good. So yeah, that's perfect. So that's
All put in the back of the prayer book.
So we could start and just talk about that a little bit next class, because I think that's interesting and helpful to just be a little bit aware of that history, and it helps explain. You might have wondered, why is it that different Christians have different Bibles, right? Like, well, all our New Testament's all the same, but why do we have different Old Testament books? Were these around in Jesus's time? Where did they come from? So we can maybe spend a couple minutes on that to start out next class, because I think it might be helpful. So feel free to look that over. You can kind of compare there. Next class, the agenda is Jesus in the Gospels. So that's what we'll
Do you have a
discuss.
similar book for next week, like you did for this?
Yeah, so next week I'll have another handout for you with some recommendations.
Which book, like Long Neck, or this week?
I'll give you another recommendation next week of a book to read.
Oh, you have to wait?
You got to wait. You got to come back next
You have to
week.
come back. You have to.
Yeah. I can't give it all to you the first class, right? So please do. Any questions you
Why
have?
don't you turn off
yeah,
the
great
PowerPoint
idea.
so you can see the people?
Great idea. How do I X out of this?
That's a great question.
I'm in it now, right? And now you're thinking, oh no. Okay, we get to the end of the PowerPoint.
You can go to the end of the PowerPoint.
Yeah. Okay.
Or hit the escape key.
Okay. It is the power. You know what we could do too is maybe put the PowerPoint up on the website too.
That's a good idea.
So, if people want to go back to it and look at it.
Really helpful.
Yeah, you can go back to it, revisit the PowerPoint. We'll put it up online.
Send me an email, remind me.
I will. Yeah, we'll do that. That'd be great. So let's see.
Let's see.
Stop share. Okay,
There
good.
you
We've
go.
got everybody.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay.
Welcome back. So next week, Jesus in the Gospels. If you have any questions for me, things that we didn't cover tonight that you're just dying to know, feel free to shoot me an email. But I think it will be good next class, maybe to just hit a couple last points that I wanted to make tonight. We can do a little review of the Old Testament canons here and jump into thinking about Jesus in the Gospels. But thanks, everybody.
Before we go, is there anybody online who has something that's burning to say or ask? All right, Max covered it.
All right. Well, let's hope so.
Well, thank you for joining us. And remember, you can always join us online or you can come in person. It's your choice.
Oh, can I say one other thing too? One quick thought. So next week, we'll be giving kind of an overview of the Gospels, what they are, and the distinctives between the four and why those are important. But for our kind of more in-depth dive, I'm going to walk us through the Gospel of Mark. That's probably the first gospel that was written. So if you have a chance between now and next week, I'd encourage you to read through the whole gospel. Take you about 45 minutes. You could do it in a setting and just jot down any notes or thoughts or questions you have as you're doing that. I think that could be really cool for us all to kind of come together in class, having Mark as a frame of reference for that. So invite you to do that. Obviously, I won't be quizzing you or,
He won't, but I will.
yeah. but I think it would be really great to do that. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Wonderful. Night.
Night.
That all.
So this.
Right.
I'll end the meeting. Yeah.
Yes.